Hello class, how are you? Just to let you know, today is National Fast Food Day. So make sure you get out and get your fast food fix for the day. It's a national day of celebration. As far as this class for today, we're going to go over chapter 11, which is policing and multiculturalism. And there's a lot of good information in this chapter. We're first going to review some history of police, how it began in England or the medieval days of Europe, and how it transferred over to the United States, and how we've progressed or maybe stepped back, and then where we're at today, how police operate and what they do and what they should do. So with that said, the Frank Pledge system began in Europe, and it was the informal practice of citizens basically policing each other. So they were protecting each other from crime. If they saw something wrong, they would report it to another person, and they would then take care of that business. So again, the social control was very informal. No one was in charge, but that's how the basic Frank Pledge system began. The French term for cover fire is couvre-feu, which in the medieval days in Europe meant to basically put out the lamps or the torches in the town because the people were going to go to bed for the night. And when the term cover fire came at a certain time, that's when the Frank Pledge system came into play, because there were people that needed to protect each other at night from marauders and killers and thieves and other folks that would invade towns. So again, we use the term curfew today for something completely different, but it began as the term cover fire. A shire in the medieval Europe days, 1600s, 1500s, were basically a mass with a land of people, or a county. Think of a county. So a shire was a county. And we brought some of these terms with us over to the United States from Europe. So we called a shire over in the United States when we got here in the 1700s, we called that a county. Now a reeve was the senior official in charge of a shire, of a county. So what do you get when you put shire and reeve together? We have the modern day term of sheriff. So that's where the term sheriff came from. It's a person in charge of a county, which it is today. That's what the sheriff does. They are in charge of policing a county. So make sure you know some of these terms. They're very interesting, and you may see them again. Some other terms, a hue and cry was a call to arms when someone was being victimized. It generated a response from all able-bodied males to attempt to bring the offender to justice. The hue and cry was used after the cover fire because someone would scream out whether it was a crime, whether it was a fire, but this was the socially acceptable way of the Frank Pledge system of other persons protecting their own. The Bow Street Runners were the first basic police persons that sought violators in London. So they were paid a sum of money when they brought the suspects before the court. They were kind of like bounty hunters, but that was the first type of policing that happened in England, called the Bow Street Runners. The most important thing that happened in England with police was the London Metropolitan Police Act. And this was passed in 1829 and led to the first formal police force called the London Metropolitan Police, and that was led by Sir Robert Peel. So Sir Robert Peel is basically the father of police in England. And 1829 wasn't that long ago that this was established, but this changed so many things for police that Robert Peel wanted to be done. Cop, we know it today as a cop, a police officer, but this began as a term for the constable on patrol in England. Other terms like this of cop come from early New York City police officers. They had very large copper buttons on their uniforms, so they got the term copper, became a slang term, but it was later shortened to cop. So those are two historical ways that we get the term cop used today. Okay, we're talking about the Civil Rights Act of 1866. The book does a good job talking about this. So you need to understand what the act did and who it protected, what rights and permissions were granted to certain people, because this had a lot of discrimination in it. When we talk about the 3 eras of policing, the book talks about this a little bit. First of all, there's the political era from 1840 to 1930. This is in the United States. Huge issues of graft and political influence and corruption that went on during this time. The Reform era followed from 1930 to 1980, and this was when police community relations suffered. There was Watts riots, police were called pigs, there was all sorts of civil unrest that went on, and technology, though, came into play. So from 1930 to 1980, what type of technology do you think occurred? Basic technology for police. Think about some of those things that came into play that helped police. But during this time, there was a lot of police community relations that suffered, and a lot of discrimination occurred, a lot of police use of force, which we'll talk about in a little bit. The third era is the community era. And this is basically police trying to reconnect with the communities, whether it's on foot patrol, whether it's community placement of officers, but it's basically adopting the community as a whole. And that's where we're at today, the community era. So make sure you know about these eras. Some court decisions that were made in the 50s, there's 2 of them that are here. The book talks about others, but basically it looked at underrepresented groups. So Mapp versus Ohio is a very important Supreme Court ruling. Also Gideon versus Wainwright, also another very important ruling that still holds true today to protect citizens from police interruption, seizures, prosecutions, etc. So again, these are some of the most important cases that came out of the 1950s Earl Warren Court. Miranda versus Arizona, we know that as the Miranda rights, and basically advise of their rights, their right to refuse to answer questions, provide information, etc. Are there any exceptions to the Miranda warning that you've heard? Are there exceptions? Basically, the exception is if you are not Mirandized after you are arrested, which there's no law or regulation that says that you have to be Mirandized at any time. The only time you have to be Mirandized is when you are being questioned about the crime for which you have been arrested for. So like I always tell my classes, when you are arrested, keep your mouth shut. Don't talk. If a person is arrested, say for robbery, and they're put in the back of the police car, and all the way to the jail to be booked, the police officer is just sitting there driving the car, not saying anything. And the person that allegedly robbed the store is in the back seat. And all of a sudden he starts talking. He says, I wasn't there at this scene, officer. He says, I wasn't there. And I know who did it, but I wasn't there. So this person will talk and talk and talk and talk and talk and talk. And everything he says can be used against him because he was not Mirandized. He just freely started talking. So again, if he starts talking about the crime, he's never been Mirandized, so therefore that's the exception. It's only when you've been Mirandized that you have that right to say no more questioning. So you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. If you cannot afford attorney, one will be afforded to you. Do you understand these rights as I have read them to you? Yes, I do. Sign here. We're good to go. Now, once they sign that declaration of Mirandizing, the officer will say, do you wish to talk to me now about this crime? And that's when you can say yes or no. If you say no, then questioning ends. It stops. There's nothing else that can be done. Okay? Once you say no or say, I want an attorney, the questioning stops. If you say yes, then you speak, and anything you say can and most time will be used against you. So again, Miranda is a very important law that came about, and it's a very old one that came out in the 60s. Still here today, but just know your rights. Usually it's best to just not talk. Terry versus Ohio talks about unreasonable searches and seizures are not violated when a police officer stops a person on the street and frisks him or her without probable cause to arrest. If the police officer has a reasonable suspicion that the person is committing or is about to commit a crime, and if the officer has a reasonable belief that the person may be armed and presently dangerous. So those are the Terry versus Ohio unreasonable searches and seizures not violated. Okay, those are the exceptions to Terry versus Ohio. And the officer has to articulate these reasons in a report about why they did that, because that is taking away a right of a person. So understand Terry versus Ohio. Those are the exceptions. And all of you soon-to-be police officers out there, you will definitely know Terry versus Ohio. Okay, go now to community policing, which is very popular nowadays, which we've heard of. So a definition of community policing is decentralized organizational design, and it's a proactive approach to policing that encourages partnerships and problem solving. So basically it works with the community. There's police officers that work in different areas of the community, lower socioeconomic, middle socioeconomic, high socioeconomic, with businesses, with the city council, with the mayor, and again, it's about what's best for the community. POP or POP or problem-oriented policing looks at specific areas of the community to take care of, specific crimes. So a POP or POP policing would include looking at the community to identify problems or areas, how to respond to the problem, and then assess if the problem has been addressed. So say there's a rash of vehicle thefts at Sac State parking lot, in one parking lot. They're going to look at that to identify that as a problem area, analyze the nature of it. Yeah, a lot of cars are getting stolen from parking lot 4, and then they're going to use resources to combat that problem, then come back later to see if what they did worked. So POP or police officer, problem-oriented policing is a very popular thing. I've worked with a few officers on some of these areas, and it could be robberies, it could be rapes, it could be whatever's going on in the city or county that has to be targeted. Policing and multiculturalism. So you know, hopefully by now, about Rodney King and what happened in 1992, and also what happened to George Floyd in 2020 recently. And a comparison of these two men is very important to do, because it's almost 30 years later that George Floyd is killed by a police officer. Rodney King was not, but a lot of things changed with Rodney King after his beating by CHP and other law enforcement agencies. But changes were made, use of force was changed, but almost 30 years later, almost the same thing happens to another innocent person. So again, don't forget the contrast between these two and how similar they are, and what ramifications are now happening because of George Floyd's death at the hands of a police officer. And 28 years later, or 30 years later, will these changes that are made now stop another issue from happening like these things did? Okay, policing and multiculturalism, talking about police personnel issues. Basically, diversity in policing is what is needed. It's always been needed, and it looks at equal opportunities to integrate policing, to have different ethnicities, different genders within the police force. Some steps to diversify policing. They should actively recruit minority communities, which they do around here in Sacramento. CHP, Sacramento, and the sheriff do. They should offer incentive pay to bilingual officers, which they do. There's many officers here in Sacramento that speak different languages, and they get paid for that. There's a stipend, 5% of their pay. There's other ways to diversify policing, which we'll talk about later. As far as underrepresentation of minority in policing, and the book talks about some of these issues, so you may want to look at these, about who was looked at to go into policing in the 80s. Why has it not been attractive to some minorities? They may think that they may not be accepted. Some have social reasons. Again, a lot of issues, and some are discriminatory about the underrepresentation of minorities in police. So make sure you understand some of these and what we can do to make this better. So promoting equal opportunity in employment. This is all employment, not just police work. There's the Equal Pay Act in 1963. Age Discrimination and Employment Act, 1967. Executive Order in 1969. Crime Control Act in 1973. Let's go back to that. If you look at these are all things, and they're not that long ago, that were enacted for equal opportunities for everybody. And this is kind of amazing that women weren't being paid the same amount of money as males. And I know that in the state where I worked, it doesn't matter if you were black, white, male, female, whatever, you got paid the same. If you were parole agent 1 and you're female, and you were black and you were a Hispanic male, parole agent 1, you get the same pay. So only in the private sector can you have different pay for different genders. But in the state, it doesn't matter. Everybody in state and county employment, you get the same pay. So a lot of these things are important, and again, it helped discrimination. Some more issues here. ADA came in 1990. Family Medical Leave Act, FMLA. That is a big thing, especially for any state, county, or private sector employees. These are some of the organizations, and there's more, that promote interests in women, cultural, racial, ethnic groups, and policing. So you can kind of read some of these. And there's many more. Maybe some of you would fall into this and join this once you become a peace officer. Police practices that contribute to tension between police and minority groups. Think about that. Police and community minority groups, and what context contribute to this. Delays in responding to calls for service. What neighborhoods get the quickest calls? Is it a Caucasian neighborhood, an Asian neighborhood, African American, Hispanic? And why? Number 2, verbal abuse, racially offensive epithets, or forms of disrespect from different ethnicities. Excessive stopping, questioning, and frisking of African Americans, driving while black, driving while brown. Discriminatory patterns of arrest and traffic citations. You need to treat everybody the same, no matter color or gender. Excessive use of physical force. We see that. We've seen that a lot lately. This is being changed because of new police use of force protocols. Excessive use of deadly force and systematic under-enforcement of the law and failure to protect law-abiding citizens. So it goes both ways, under-enforcement and over-enforcement. So for you future police officers, this is your call to duty to make sure that you don't do these things as they have been done. Factors that influence an officer's use of discretion. Police officers have an awesome job, and I don't mean really cool, I mean awesome. It's a huge, great responsibility because you take people's rights away from them. And you have full discretion on what you can and cannot do. So we're going to look at some factors that influence the use of discretion as a police officer. One is the guidance from the department. Is it a law and order department or is it a community-based department? Are you supposed to get out there, kick ass, take names, arrest people? Or are you supposed to be more an educator out there that's going to help the community? Number two is your situational characteristics. Time of day. Is it at night? Is it 2 in the morning? Are you alone? Are there witnesses around to see what you're doing with this suspect? What is the race of the suspect? Those are some situational characteristics that are looked at as far as discretion. Everything's more dangerous at night. Everything's more dangerous when you're working alone. You may think it's more dangerous when you're dealing with somebody of a different race. Officer characteristics. Male or female, minority or non-minority, and the neighborhood or community influences. Do you feel safer pulling over somebody for speeding in a wealthy neighborhood or in a lower socioeconomic neighborhood? Also, some factors are your own biases that you have, and everybody has inherent biases. So that's another thing to check at the gate before you begin your career is your biases. You have to be very objective as a law enforcement officer. Okay, this task force on 21st century policing identified 6 areas of recommendations for policing. So this is the book talking about this, kind of interesting recommendations. Obviously, building trust and legitimacy. How do you do that? How do you build trust? Is it words? Is it actions? Is it 5 years of actions? Policy and oversight. Who has the oversight? Is it the governor? Is it the mayor? Is it the city council? Is it a task force that has police oversight of a city? Sacramento has one of those. They look at all use of force issues. Technology and social media. That's huge. That's a big thing right now. Community policing and crime reduction. We've talked about that already, how to do that. It's a recommendation to continue that. Training and education, like we've always talked about, police need continuous training and education. And officer wellness and safety. There is a high incidence of law enforcement officers committing suicide, and they have a very high rate of divorce because of the stresses on the job. So officer wellness and safety is also stressed for these recommendations. Okay, that's our chapter. And again, if you have any questions, go ahead and place those onto the discussion board. And if not, just let me know. And we will talk to you soon. Make sure you read the chapter. And thank you. Have a great day.